Hi everyone. I understand that the video last night that I recorded had no sound, so I am re-recording the video. Hopefully this works better. I used a hotspot to do the recording, so I think that may have something to do with the quality of the YouTube video. So I want to spend a few minutes going over the readings that we have for this week and addressing some of what the paper this week is going to be about. So this week we are doing several chapters from the Trattner book. I always have trouble with that word. Chapters 6 through 12, and they cover everything from the time from the end of the Civil War, where we began to have scientific inquiry and industrialization, modernization of the country through the 1920s, and what was social welfare like prior to the Great Depression in 1929. And in between that, it covers specific social issues. So you have child welfare, you have the mental health movement, you have the settlement house movement, and the public health movement as some examples of social welfare policy that evolved from, say, the 1870s, 1880s through the 1920s. The other chapter is on the professionalism of social work, and that's somewhat different chapter looking at who we are as a profession, who were some of our pioneers, what were their philosophies, and how did they help to create the profession as we know it today, and in what ways was there conflict even amongst social workers 100 years ago. So I want to highlight a few things. First is that in the 1870s, 1880s, as I said, an era of scientific evolution, we begin to have a question of how we define things. So what does it mean to be in poverty? What does it mean to have a social issue? Who's deserving and who's not deserving? So there were several big names that came to be known from that era. There were several literary writers who wrote about the times then, who became important in how we define things. So books were really, this was the beginning of, with the printing press, that we could have books in mass publication, getting out to people. People could read different, 100 years earlier, only a few could read. And so with the publication of newspapers, the publication of books, the publication of news magazines, things changed. And the way in which we understood social issues changed. So when we think about that today is we are in a new era with social media, and it's changing the ways in which we see things. We talked about that the other day in several of our chats, that we are more aware of social issues and the interaction between police departments and communities of color, particularly young Black men, than we ever were. And is that because of social media? Well, we became aware of social issues differently 150 years ago because of social media. It was just a different kind of social media. And people were just as up in arms back then about issues as we are now. I mean, Dorothea Dix, we read about her in an earlier chapter, but she continues to do her work through the late 1800s. The other thing that was influencing this time is enlightenment. People looking at, who we are, how we evolve, how we become the best that we can be. And so the concept of survival of the fittest began to was a movement that began to influence how we understood social problems and who was deserving and undeserving. And so this idea of an able-bodied person became really important. Then we move into child welfare and the Children's Aid Society and Charles Loring Brace. He's an important name in the development of child welfare services in New York, which was one of the first states to evolve child welfare. And, who we are as a child welfare, go back and look at the evolution of it from that point in time. And the first case of child abuse was the way they were able to bring it to a legal remedy was they used the protection of animals, that you couldn't be cruel to an animal, therefore you should not be cruel to a child. And, are we so very different as we evolve our understanding of human interaction today, looking at how we treat animals versus how we treat people? Okay, then I want to just bring out a couple other names. Clifford Beers, A Mind That Found Itself. He was one of the first writers to do a memoir about his experience with mental illness and being institutionalized and then released, and his own recovery and his perception of the ways in which he was mistreated in the institution. Uh, and when I teach some other classes, women's issues, human sexuality, for another university, I always have people read memoirs because I think that lived experience is really important to, what our understanding of what's going on. I'm just going to pause here to say that was my son Josh. They're getting ready to go outside and go swimming, so I apologize that he just walked behind me. Um, then it talked about the settlement house movement, and you all know Jane Addams, but some of the other names, Lillian Wald and Florence Kelly, they were the foremothers of that kind of community social work, and the ways in which they reached out and embraced the immigrant community, the migrant community, the Black community post Civil War was very important to an understanding of who social work would be in the future, that person in the environment perspective. Then you got to the chapter on is social work a profession? And Abraham Flexner in 1915 gave a presentation where he challenged that social work was not a profession. And that paper had uh, reverberated through the field as it was just in its infancy and has continued to be part of our conversation even 100 years later. What does it mean to be a social worker? Some of you may be aware that Pennsylvania just recently is putting through title protection, meaning who can call themselves a social worker. Some of you may work in organizations where you have a coworker whose position, whose job title is social worker, but they don't have a degree in social work. That is what title protection will do. It will change who can be called a social worker. So you all are getting your MSW because you value that degree. You value what being a social worker will do for you professionally, possibly personally. And so title protection will give you, that ability to know what it means to be a social worker. Pennsylvania is one of the last states to pass that legislation. So that's very important. What does it mean to be a professional? The other name that is highlighted in the book is Mary Richmond and the scientific method, and her making more of a medical model understanding of social work, casework, diagnosis, social diagnosis. And so when we think about the evolution, the early history of social work, we think of Jane Addams on one end and Mary Richmond on the other. Jane Addams wants to meet people where they are, change the community in which they live in, make the government more responsive to their needs. And Mary Richmond wants to fix the person, wants to fix their diagnosis. So that really, if you look now as we evolve history over the next 80 to 100 years, starting with the 1920s, we will see how those two streams of thought go, work throughout the profession. The community organizing, the macro practice, the person in the environment versus the individual model, the medical model, the DSM model. So, as you are writing your papers, I think it's important to use the Trattner book as relevant and then to draw in outside sources. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to be available. But I think that one of the things I want you to be thinking about as you're reading this is what if you took, there are several times that I think you could take sentences or paragraphs right out of Trattner, put them on a piece of paper, hand them to somebody in 2016, and they would think you were writing today. Can you identify something that parallels exactly what's happening? And with it being a presidential election, I think it's even more important. How does it parallel what our candidates are saying? Where are they drawing upon historical understandings? Immigration. Donald Trump has certainly made some statements regarding immigration. where do they come from? What is the history? How have we treated immigrants over the years? So I hope this is helpful as an introduction. I will be doing some notes tomorrow and having them posted on those chapters, and I will have all of your grading up to date through tomorrow. Okay, I have a great night, and I look forward to chatting with all of you soon. Thanks.